Brian, so great for you to join me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I'm glad to be here, Ryan.
I did this social media experiment probably 2 or 3 months ago, and I wrote the word homeschool and I posted it in a picture on Instagram, and it was without a doubt one of my most controversial posts.
Uh-oh.
And it was interesting because I had people from both ends of the spectrum and anywhere in between that were huge advocates for homeschool, and those who were adamantly against it. And it was very interesting. But I think the concept of homeschooling, which I'm not sure if you're familiar, we've been doing 2 years now, my wife and I and our family. This concept is very polarizing for a lot of people. Do you find that to be true?
I do. And I think one of the best ways to deal with it, Ryan, is skip the word homeschooling. Like toss the H word out of the conversation and go to some core ideas. Like, I'll just throw a couple out and you can go where you want to go with this. Customization, individualization, flexibility, competence, role of parents. Like, just throughout the word homeschooling, and let's talk about education. And I think that's one of the best ways to go about this discussion.
I think that's a great point, because homeschool has maybe a bit of I don't know if stigma is the right word associated with it, or some sort of connotation or preconceived notion of what it means. When I grew up and went to school, I mean, I'll be really frank. It seemed to me, from my perspective as a young man, that the homeschooled kids were kind of the weird kids. And now we're doing homeschooling, and I see a lot of other people doing it. I find out how many people were actually, I'm using the label again, homeschooling. But there is so much benefit that comes with it if we don't have that negative connotation immediately when we go straight to this idea of educating your own children.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's also very important for men and women to look at things historically. And the reality is, for thousands of years, parent-directed home and family-based education was the norm all over the world. Thousands of years. And it's really relatively new that the institutionalization of children became the norm. So, you go back just like the early days of the United States of America, nobody would say things like, well, we're worried about the socialization of Abraham Lincoln. Oh, we're concerned about Pearl S. Buck and her ability to get along with other people. We're worried about the founders and how they didn't sit with the same age peers, 28 of them for 6 hours per day. Nobody thought that. So because you and me and about 4 generations before that, we were institutionalized, that's only the real reason why we're concerned, because that was normal. And, I think that's a big question for men and women. What is so great about normal? Are you trying to be normal? Does normal define life? Does the middle of the bell-shaped curve, does that equal good because it's statistically average? And I think most of us, if we're honest, will say, no, that's not what I'm looking for my children is normal. What's normal? Like a bad literacy rate, a low voting rate, too high on the addiction to drug rate. I mean, is that what we want for our children? Normal? Do we want them to be peer dependent rather than adult oriented? Do we want them to be afraid to say their opinion because they're afraid of what the clique will say? There's so much involved in this. It's really, yeah. And you mentioned when you thought of homeschool kids, they seem kind of weird. Well, now we have to define weird, don't we?
We do. Absolutely. Well, you said something interesting when you talked about being connected with their peers versus being connected with their adults. My children, over the past 2 years, because of the situation in which we live and the fact that we educate our children here at home, have some tremendous opportunities to interact with adults. And I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can because they are my children. But my children are able to communicate with adults so much more effectively than I think generally young children are, because they're so comfortable and conditioned to only communicate with their little 12 and 13-year-old friends who also don't know anything about life.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So we're going to have fun here, I think, with both experience and research. Okay. So
Perfect.
so let's do experience for a minute. I remember long ago, this is probably 25 years ago, uh, the veterinarian, we raise a few sheep and we have a few animals, so the veterinarian called my office, calling me back, and whoever was helping at the time said, National Home Education Research Institute. And then they transferred the vet to me, and he said, what do you do there anyway? I said, hey, we do research on homeschooling, and we keep track of homeschoolers, and we study homeschoolers, and we talk about homeschooling. And he said, without any elicitation from me, say, you know what I noticed about homeschool kids? I thought, uh-oh, what? And he said, when they're in my office, they talk with me and they look me in the eye. I said, what do the other ones do? He said, they kind of look away. They don't interact with me. They're playing with their little gizmos. That was at the beginning of gizmos, He said,
Sure.
He said, I've noticed overall that home educated kids are more comfortable. It's easy. It's not even a big deal because, and I think you know this, because home educated children, they interact with their parents. Then they might be 10 years old, but they interact with babies. They go out and they talk with people in the stores, in the museums, on the streets all day long. And they're not allowed to have a same age clique. It's not that you forbid it. It's just that it's not there.
It's not there. It's not available.
It's not there. So they have friends who might be same age. They have friends who are different ages. They're in scouts, they're in soccer, they're in football, they're in the local cooperative, whatever. And I think, Ryan, what really is different here, and I think people have to really look at this, and that's why I said let's throw out the word homeschooling. I was sitting on a plane on the way to a research conference. I attend this research conference every year. I've been going to it since 1988. On the airplane, on the way to the conference, and there's a lady sitting next to me in the middle. And just because we have fun telling stories, right? She's a Black woman. We're going to the same conference. And she's, well, what do you do? What do you do? You know how that goes. What do you do? What do you do? I told her research on homeschooling. And she said, this was about 10 years ago. Well, what about socialization? And how many thousands
That's
of times.
The common one. That's the common one.
Thousands of times. I said, well, what do you do for socialization? She's probably about 35. Well, I'm in a book club and I play tennis with friends. I said, that's just like home educated kids.
Sure.
They do things. They get to pick and choose with their parents' permission what they do, like adults, instead of like kids behind a cyclone fence with same age peers for 6 hours a day. They don't get to choose their friends or to do things. But adults, that's real life. So it's really parent-led home-based education is much more like real life than school is. I mean, almost all of us know that.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's interesting as you talk about this with kids that do things. Of course, our 4 children do things. We have dance class, we have football, we have jujitsu, we have some neighbors that also educate their children at home who come over and play. And we do it in a controlled environment, which is very important. It's funny to me, I think in society, what we're moving towards, and I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on this, is that we give children too much authority and autonomy, and we almost, in a way, allow them to dictate every element and aspect of their lives. But their children, they're not even capable of making these decisions of who their friends should be and what choices should they make and what activities should they belong to. That's my job as a parent.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, in the United States and actually most of the Western world, we've gotten all confused about raising children. Okay. So now we could get really philosophical here. And so it really depends on your worldview. Okay. And you might be I don't really know much about you, but a person listening might be a secular humanist, evolutionist, metaphysical naturalist. Okay. I'm a Christian. I have a worldview. We all have a worldview. We all have presuppositions to, how we come to issues like raising children. And people can be very conflicted. Like, oh no, we don't think a child's old enough to decide whether to use a gun. We don't, own a gun. We don't think a child's old enough to, be able to decide whether to get drunk or not. But on the other hand, we say, oh yeah, let's just do, let the child decide whatever he wants all day long, who to associate with, what to learn. We're totally conflicted. I'm of the worldview that says, hey, wait a minute, you're an adult, you have more wisdom, You're the father. You're the leader of the family. You're the leader of the pack. You have experience. You've read the classics. Maybe you've read things like the Bible. You have wisdom, and you need to use that to lead and nurture and admonish and instruct and help your children. So yeah, absolutely. We've lost that. And I've met people, even in my worldview group of friends, they're totally confused because they've been listening to what culture's been telling them. I say, no, wait a minute. You're the dad. You have more wisdom. You have more experience. Lead your children with gentleness and love, but lead your children. And you get to do that when you home educate.
Yeah. And you get to do it. Well, I mean, here's the interesting thing. Let's say you send your child off to school for whatever reason, whether you feel like it's some sort of obligation or just that's what we do. And so it's easier and more convenient for whatever reason. And that kid is at school for 8 hours a day, and they're being taught by their friends primarily. They're being taught by teachers who you don't personally know what their worldviews are, what you just said. And then you don't see them except for when you ship them off on the bus, or maybe you take them to school. So you see them for 15 minutes in the morning. They get home. Parents aren't eating dinner with their kids like they used to. So, and then after dinner, they are on their gizmos, like you said earlier, watching TV. And maybe the average family has an hour with their children. Who do you think is teaching your children? And where do you think their worldview is going to come from? From your hour, or from the 8 or 9 hours of other training and indoctrination that they're picking up?
Absolutely. It's taken a while. Okay. But this is, to me, very interesting. I had to learn this on my own. I did not learn this during my doctoral studies. Home-based education directed by the parents was the norm in United States until about 1900. People don't realize that. And then some people say, well, that's because they were all farmers. No, they were not all farmers. A lot of them lived in towns and villages and small cities. It was because they knew that it was their job. It was their duty. It was their responsibility. It was not a, quote, right given to them by the government. It was their duty. They taught them reading, writing, basic math. They taught them how to run businesses. They taught them how to invent. They taught them how to do carpentry. That was basically how it worked. And it was not until 1900 that a majority of children were institutionalized, because a certain group of people, this is history, who like to control what an American is. So we got to get them all in a place where we can mold their thoughts and mold their attitudes. That is not being a man and a leader of a family, letting somebody else mold your child, letting the government say, well, you know what, this decade, we need more engineers. So we're going to try to push more people to be engineers. Oh, no, this decade, we need more, low end workers. That is just ridiculous. We're conflicted. We say we believe in the individual. We believe in a child learning to be what he or she wants to do or be. And yet we send them away to a place called public school to let them teach, train, and indoctrinate them. Yeah, when you home educate, it's much more customized to the child, and you're much more in charge, which is really fun for a family. It becomes a whole way of living. And like you said, we even have research that shows children who are more peer dependent, which is almost all kids in public schools, do worse. They do worse on a lot of measures than those who are adult oriented.
I like this concept of customization. I'll tell you when it clicked for me, because my wife and I spent a lot of time deliberating as to whether or not we were going to educate our children here, or we were going to have them enroll in the school district into the place that we moved. And we had decided to make the decision to have them schooled here at home by primarily my wife, with, of course, my contribution as often as I can with my work. And I remember one thing in particular. I got done for the day, and I went downstairs and I talked with my kids about how their day was. And they said, come check this out, Dad. And there was a frog in a bowl. And I said, well, that's a cool frog. Where did you find it? And they said, actually, Dad, it's not a frog. It's a toad. And I said, well, okay, it looks like a frog. I don't know the difference between a toad and a frog. And then they said, well, let me tell you. And what was cool is they walked around the field. We have some land here, and they had found this toad and brought it back. And then they spent time researching what is the difference between a toad and a frog, because there was some conflicting thoughts between them. And they researched it and planned it and figured it out. And then they were able to articulate that to me. It is a very small little experience, seemingly insignificant, but it made a huge shift in the way that I thought about educating our children and being able to
Yeah.
give them this customization.
Yeah. In just one story, you have encapsulated a huge portion of what, parent-directed, family-based education is. I mean, right there, you just did it. I mean, and I know I've done like many interviews. I wish I'd recorded all of these, of men and women all over the world, on the airplanes, at gas stations, in stores, in Poland, in the United States, in South Africa, and it's fascinating to me. I'm just going to give you a rough number, okay? I did not record all this. The majority of men basically hated school.
Of course.
I'll just be blunt, okay? I would say a little less women hated school. Women, especially when they got to junior high, and it's like, I've got pimples. Am I pretty enough? The nasty attacks, the bullying. Men, it was kind of like, I'm checked out. I'm on average. Men are more, boys are more physically active. I'm sure you've talked about these things, in your initiative.
Of course.
On average, are more physically active, and they're supposed to sit down, shut up, and act more like a girl listening to a lady teacher. This is all. There's so much wrapped up in institutional schooling, but you turn kids loose. You make sure they learn their basic math. They learn how to read. They can write a one-page essay, and then you let them do all kinds of things like what you talked about. It's incredible how much more, on average, they love learning, and how much more they learn. And we had so much fun. We did home educate our children, and it's just incredible. I mean, my wife would look outside and say, where in the world, I'm not going to use their names. Where's our son? Okay, we have a son and 7 daughters. Where's our son? Well, I guess I already said his name. We only have one of them. But anyway, where is he? He'd be out there. He'd come back in and say, hey, Mom, I was watching earthworms. You were watching earthworms? She was leading a homeschool co-op teaching biology, and the topic came up of earthworm reproduction. So my wife studied. She said, man, I just don't quite understand this, how earthworms reproduce. So she's sitting there with our son and some other home educated kids. And Daniel says, well, I know. He says, I watched them. He'd watched earthworms mate and knew exactly how it worked. It's just incredible. And so you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, he's using observation skills. Mm-hmm. He's being patient. He's not stressed out by, you got to go to the next lesson, which might be a really stupid lesson that, all 20,000 kids in our city have to learn on this day. It's just a totally different world. It's a totally different world, Ryan.
It is. We've been the beneficiary of that. I think the biggest, there's probably 4 or 5 common objections. There's probably a lot, but there's probably 4 or 5 common ones. And I think that one of the biggest objections or concerns that people have is that they're not qualified to do it. And I've heard people say that, well, school teachers are more qualified to do that. Now, I know you are were a public school teacher, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the qualifications and what you were learning. And are you more or less qualified as a parent who didn't go through that formal education? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is a great question. And as an expert witness in court cases, I've had to carefully scrutinize this question, for over 30 years. And yes, I was a government certified teacher. And then I became a professor of education, teaching teachers and teaching science. And I really had to think this all through, Ryan. And let me explain it in one of the simplest ways I can. You can go buy, you don't even have to buy a curriculum, but you could go buy a $19 curriculum that would help a child. You could be the parent teaching a child phonics to learn the sounds of letters. A $19 curriculum. You put a little poster on the wall, has these phonograms, this little booklet, and it says, okay, do this with your child. And you can teach them how to read.
Of course, anybody can do that.
No college degree, no courses on child psychology, no government license, no $100,000 of college tuition. And we know from experience that parents are absolutely capable and competent to do this. We know from thousands of years of history that people learned how to read, Ryan. Can you imagine that? They learned how to read without government licensed teachers. We don't even have to get into all of that. How could I not convince somebody already? Thousands of years people learn how to read without government licensed teachers, without people going to university for 4 years to be a trained teacher.
Right.
A lot of that is about managing groups of children. A lot of teacher education program is about making the state happy that you're teaching what the state wants taught, which
right.
any given decade could be this bandwagon or that bandwagon or this bandwagon or that bandwagon.
Of
We don't even have to
course.
get into that. I mean, we could spend an hour on, what is critical race theory and what does that have to do with teaching my child to be an honest, respectable, and respectful human being. Okay, so teacher education programs and government licenses to teach has a whole lot to not do with teaching children to read, write, do basic math and some science. It has nothing to do with, so, and we also, yeah.
I was going to say, I've got some personal friends who are school teachers, and I am very critical. People know this. I'm very critical of the public school system, but I don't ever want that to be conflated with the individuals who I know, school teachers who I know, who are trying to do their best, who have a good heart, who want to serve their children. But when I talk to these individuals, what they're so frustrated with is not actually being with their children. It's the red tape and all the hoops and all the documentation that they need to jump through in order to make sure, like you said, that we're teaching what is quote unquote supposed to be taught and what quote unquote they're supposed to learn.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that a bulk majority of what these school teachers are doing or are inundated with has nothing to do with face-to-face one-on-one interaction with a child, and more to do with, let me fill out the paperwork, let me go to this certification or this training, and they're hamstringed by all the stuff they need to do.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And most people don't know this. I've taught graduate level courses on testing and measurement. We hear about standardized tests, right?
Sure.
So on the one hand, we have this myth in our minds that public institutional schooling is all about helping Johnny and Lucinda learn how to read, write, do math, and love learning, right? We always have this myth in our heads. But when you get into standardized testing and state accountability, these tests have a lot to do with treating groups of children like cattle to see whether they gained enough weight and whether you should add a little bit of more selenium to the feed or not. It's about group processes. It's about accountability between the state and the taxpayer. It's about looking good or not looking good. It's about doing what the teachers' unions want or don't want. There's so much involved in government-run institutional schooling. It has nothing to do with the benefit of each child. And I think it's really fun. I enjoy doing this with teachers. Like I said, I've been a teacher. Let's skip the H word, right? Skip homeschooling and ask any public or even private school teacher, would it be good to customize the curriculum for each child's strengths, weaknesses, desires, and dreams? Absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah. I would say, and would it be good to individualize based on each child's, kind of strengths, weaknesses, talents, limitations? Oh, yeah. We talk about that in our education courses. And would it be good to have a flexible schedule so like here in Western Oregon, if all of a sudden it's a sunny day, we can just say, hey, bag school, we're going to the coast and study the tide pools. Oh, yeah, that'd be a dream world. Just go down the list. Would it be good? Is it good? See, people are conflicted about this, even on the topic we're on. We have campaigns to stop bullying, right? Picking on kids and beating them up and treating them in whatever racist ways or whatever. You say that's bad for kids. And then somebody goes, oh, but if they're home educated, they won't be around bullying. Wait a minute, you're conflicted. We all know it's not good for bullying and people to be mean to each other.
Of course. Yeah.
Is it better to have a safe and comfortable environment, or is it one that where you're bullied all the time? Just go down the list with teachers, skip the H word, and go through these traits, and you're going to have to say, wow, is that systemically what you're talking about when you're talking about home-based education? Yes. Yeah.
And what's interesting is you say this too. You talk about bullying. there are things that your children need to learn, but you can introduce conflict and conflict management and conflict resolution in an environment that is healthy as opposed to them getting bullied at school. So an example of that would be my children participate in jujitsu. And my oldest son, who's 13 years old, he trains with me and other men. He doesn't train with kids. He trains with men. And these are grown men. These are men who have been training jujitsu for a very long time. And he rolls with those men.
Yeah.
We've introduced this deliberately and intentionally so that he knows how to defend himself, not against a schoolyard bully, against a 220-pound man. That's who he's training against.
Yes.
It does take some. Go ahead.
Yeah. And you're doing it with somebody, again, who is supposed to be, adults are supposed to be wiser, more experienced.
Right.
And they have the good of the child at heart.
Right.
Hey, two 12-year-olds with the nature that's in humans, one's a big bully and one's a mild-mannered kid. They do not have the good of the other at heart. And you don't have teachers around to help out. We all know this. I mean, we all know this, what happens in institutional schools. It's often like the Lord of the Flies. It's really bad. And it damages boys. It damages girls. And they become withdrawn. Research shows that those who are home educated, there's all this politically correct terminology, right? Like, you want to have a voice, you want to be empowered. Well, guess what? Children who are peer dependent, they lose their voice and they're not empowered. And they're controlled by the mob usually. And we have research that shows home educated kids more likely going to keep their voice than they're going to be themselves. And they're not going to be controlled by the mob. It's just fascinating what we're learning from 40 years of research on home education. Yeah.
Was there any sort, you said this happened in the early 1900s where we started to institutionalize so many kids. Was there, and what you had said is that it was for government control, which I can definitely see, but it's not usually as blatant as that because it would be so obvious and parents would resist that. So was there any sort of external circumstances that caused people to be more open to this idea of shipping their kids off for 8 to 10 hours a day into these schools?
Yeah. Let's go back a little bit and want to make sure it's clear what I said. So here we are going along. You've got the Europeans coming to North America, and I'm not an expert on Native Americans, so I'm not going to get into that. Okay, so we got the settlers and things happening, and America's growing, and then we've got the United States forms, and we have home-based parent-directed education. That's what we have. We have inventions, we have creativity, we have discoveries, we have literacy. You go back and read what people are reading, the average person. We had high literacy. Now, what we had was we had people like Horace Mann and others who, for whatever reasons, they start to think they want to decide what a good American is. And some of them, this is really fascinating stuff. You go read John Taylor Gatto's The Underground History of American Education. You go read about Prussian education. I would call these people, I'll just call them controllers. They're controllers and they're elitists. They believe I have the way that all Americans should be raised and my worldview is best. Okay. Some of them, for example, did not like dirty Irish Catholic immigrants. So they wanted to turn them into good, clean, hardworking, whatever Americans. That's very elitist. That's very controlling. That's very bigoted. In fact, the Roman Catholics fought the common school idea. And a lot of Christians fought this common school idea. And a lot of liberty-minded people fought this common school idea. But the ones who like to control people, they won. Okay, that's it. They won. So they started spreading compulsory schooling laws. And then they started spreading the idea that the government must provide tax-funded education. So here, now we have, Ryan, even today, I'm going a lot of places here. You get me back in order. But now we have people who are self-professed libertarians, self-professed liberty lovers, self-professed biblical thinkers, self-professed free marketers. But at the same time, they're supporting statist schooling. They're supporting the forced redistribution of wealth, socialistic government-run education. A lot of my friends are conflicted. On the one hand, they think they're freedom lovers, but on the other hand, they're supporting government-controlled, government-forced redistribution of tax-funded education. So it happens slowly, Ryan. I mean, so that by 1900, we get the majority of children in government-run institutional schools. But by the way, it was only for a few months, and it was only a few hours per day. Think about that. So then time passes, 10 years, another 10 years, 50 years, till all of a sudden we've got 87% of the children in government-run institutions for 6 hours per day. It was a slow, gradual change. And so now you have government agents controlling the teaching, training, and indoctrination of children every day. 87% of Americans are in that. Now, and I want to be real clear, whether you homeschool, private school, or public school, children are taught, trained, and indoctrinated, okay? I want to be clear.
Right.
In all of those. But if you're a freedom lover, if you're a person who says, I believe in free market, I believe in, children not being controlled by the state, like in Sparta, like Plato's Republic, then why do you have them taught, trained, and indoctrinated by the government for 6 hours per day? These are really important questions philosophically. And we also know from the research so far, there are some real benefits to home-based education. I mean, academically, social development, and success in adulthood. So I think people need to look at this both philosophically and empirically.
Yes, I think that's a good point. It is interesting because every once in a while I'll use the term that our children are being indoctrinated, and occasionally somebody will come back and say, "Well, aren't you doing the same thing?" And the answer is, "Of course."
Yeah, exactly.
Of course I am. But that's my responsibility as their father. That is my moral obligation to indoctrinate them into a set of values, beliefs, principles, actions, behaviors, disciplines that I, as their father, believe will serve them best.
You got it. I mean, here's your alternative. So I've been going to this. I mentioned this big giant research conference I attend every year. Picture this: 12,000 to 15,000 professors of education, doctoral students, social scientists, and it's so, the worldview of most of them, let's just say, is very different from mine, just very, very different from mine. But I remember maybe 20 years ago, I started using the word indoctrination. They scowled at me. They did not like that term. We don't indoctrinate children. I said, whoa, listen to what I said. Whether the children are in government-controlled schools all day, private institutional schools all day, or home-based education, they are taught, trained, and indoctrinated. Because all indoctrination means is you are trying to put into your child certain things you believe and value. Everybody does that. Public government schools do that. Homeschoolers do that. The question is, who should be doing it, and which values do you want going into them? Right. I mean, we can see based on history, and you can just look around in your lifetime. We can see what the general overall result is of government-run education. 87% of people go through that. And I know they have a very different worldview when they get out of that than my children do. Very different.
When you say 87%, so that leaves 13%.
Yeah.
Are those other 13% in, what is that comprised of? Is that home-based education? Is that private schooling? What is that other element comprised of?
Both. It's private institutional schools and home-based education. So it's just, since we're on that, it's really interesting because people who are of the worldview of free market, classical liberal libertarianism, say biblical Christianity, they've been watching that 13% for the last 20 years, thinking, why doesn't that change? Why doesn't it go up to 18 or 20%, and maybe kind of break the monopoly of the government school system? It's tough. I mean, let's face it, the government takes your money for your property taxes by force, the power of the sword, and pumps it into government-controlled schooling. And if you want to put your child in a, let's say a new age private school, or a Catholic private school, or a Muslim private school, or a Jewish private school, want to homeschool your child, you pay twice. So that is literally a monopoly that they have. Now, the numbers have shifted a little bit, but the biggest change has been the increase in home education. So whereas, back in the 70s, home education was about 0% of school age children, by March of 2020, it was getting up to be around, my best estimate is 2.6 million children K through 12 in homeschooling. And then the US Census Bureau has done some surveys in the last year, kind of like experimental studies. And they think home education basically doubled from March of 20 to March of 21. So that would put
COVID related, I imagine.
Yeah. I call it government control related. So when the government starts to control schools, a lot of families said, hey, I don't like that. Or the controls are so bizarre. Our children are not learning and it's too much change. Anyway, homeschooling now is about 5 million children, 4.5 to 5 million children. But we don't know, when the government controls back off, right, and institutional schools open up more, will all of those, 100% increase stay? Probably not. But I think it's still going to be a significant number who have now tried homeschooling and say, wow, this is good for a lot of reasons we never thought of. We have our child is not anxious every morning getting on the school bus. We have better relationships between parent and child. The siblings know each other better. They're kind of enjoying each other. They start to have a freedom that they didn't have before. They're happier about learning. They have more time to read. This one or that one's not being bullied so much. Parents over the last year have learned a lot of things about home education. On the other hand, you got parents saying, I hate that. I don't want to spend that much time with my children.
Which is a shame. I mean, that really is. One of the things that I've noticed with my own children is even before I came in and did this podcast, I walked down the hall and I walked past my daughter's room into my office. And I said, hey, what are you doing, bud? She's like, I'm just sitting here playing with my Barbies. And it struck me, and I've observed this over the past, even just several weeks. My kids are so much better equipped to entertain themselves. They can sit in silence. They can be creative. They can learn different things. They can sit there and they're not lonely. She isn't lonely. She's there playing and she's being creative and she's thinking, but she's by herself. And that is a new phenomenon for us over the past couple of years where they've been able to entertain themselves.
Ryan, I've seen that for the last 35 years interacting with homeschool families and I want to make sure we say something here. There's an overlap and there's a synthesis of different things that become easier to do, more natural to do when you home educate. Okay. When we talked about this before, when the child is with peers 6 hours per day, for some kids, it's more than that. When you add the bus time and you add the public school sports, that really becomes their whole life. And it controls how they do things, very much so. But when you home educate, they're freed of that. And I've seen, this is one of my working hypotheses. I cannot prove this with research, but it's one of my working hypotheses. I've had so many parents tell me, but Brian, Dr. Ray, we don't even really study science, but when our children are tested, they score above average in science. And I said, well, what do you do? Well, we let them explore. They get to read a lot. We talk a lot. We discuss things. I mean, I just described, Ryan, what it's about. That's learning. When you have the opportunity and the time to read books, you have the opportunity and time to go out in the yard, whether you live in the city or whether you live in the country, just to go out in the yard and play with flowers or butterflies or insects. I mean, you learn so much. And when you have interaction back and forth between an adult who has more knowledge, more wisdom, more love than a peer and a child, you get a lot of learning and a lot of deeper learning than you would in a same age peer group on a government controlled schedule. It's just incredible what happens.
There's a lot of practical application as well. A lot of guys have heard, my oldest son and I are building a canoe and him, rather than looking at a textbook about how to do fractions and decimals, he's reading it off a tape measure. He's learning about fractions off a tape measure as we build this thing. Practical application, same lessons being learned, but in a different context that I believe, and you're the one who's done all the research on this, so I defer to you on this, but I believe will serve him infinitely better because he knows how to apply the information that's being learned. And there's an element of wisdom, which is applied knowledge, not just the knowledge itself. So it just seems to me that it's infinitely better over time. But I will say this, because I want to try to be as level-headed and fair in this discussion as we can. Are there some hindrances and some challenges that those who want to have their children's education based at home that they should be aware of, they should be cautious of, maybe some pitfalls to avoid?
That's good. Let's just say this up front. Just because you do parent-led home-based education does not mean everybody's going to be happy all the time. It does not necessarily mean all your children, when they turn 18, will be beautiful, handsome, rocket scientists, and they'll all get, whatever job or whatever college scholarship they want. No, nobody's saying that, okay? It's not like that. But when I talk about the research, I'm saying on average, they do better than average, okay? Also keep in mind that if you have a child who's in an institutional school and he or she is average in math, if you home educate, chances are he or she will do better. So because you have all of that one-on-one and you have that time and you have the flexibility and you can stop and help them master whatever they're learning, whether it's using a tape measure, whether it's a times tables or whatever. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is dad or mom, if you kind of like delegating, raising your children to somebody else, if you don't want to take life seriously with them, if you kind of want to be lazy, if you have convinced yourself you need 2 incomes when you don't need 2 incomes, well, then probably don't want to home educate. But you see how I put that? I mean, I am sort of trying to lay a guilt trip on people. When you
I was going to say, I don't know how fair it sounds, but I am really interested in the way that you take this.
Yeah, I want to take it a certain way because culture says, oh, but you just don't understand, Brian, how many people need 2 incomes.
Right.
Well, actually, I do understand. Okay. My wife and I raised 8 children. I've never been a high income person. I've been generally a median income to a lower median income person. There are choices we make in our lives. Okay. Do you need 2 vehicles or do you want 2 vehicles? Do you need a nicer vehicle or do you want a nicer vehicle? Do you need 2 vacations or do you want 2 vacations? All right. I'm serious about this, Ryan. This is a very serious topic. Now, somebody's going to right away say, oh, but what about the single parent? Okay, I'm not talking about that right now. I'm talking about, a mom and a dad with children, what they need versus what they want. Okay, now let's talk about the single parent. All right. That is rough. That's tough. I wouldn't want to do that. That's hard. I'm not going to deny that. That's hard. Now, what do people do if they're a single parent and they would like to do parent-directed home-based education? They look for relationships, right? They look for friends. They look for homeschool co-ops. Maybe they're part of a church and there's some support there. Maybe there's a grandma nearby or an auntie nearby. You start becoming creative, right? And you don't think I can do everything myself, independent, individual American. You start to humble yourself a little bit and you have relationships. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands in America of single parents who home educate their children, of low income, high income, black, brown, white skin, whatever. There are so many people who know and have found ways to home educate their children. But it's not necessarily easy. You got to put work into it. But I want to say one more thing.
Not only is it not easy, it is harder. I've done both. It's harder to have our children educated here. It's much more rewarding and fulfilling, but it's harder. No doubt about it.
Yes, and I think that's very important to say. With that, it is harder work. However, when your children are in an institution, there are some very strange problems that come with that too. And there might be some positive influences, but there are a lot of negative influences too. And I'll just pop in one statistic for the sake of the discussion here. The U.S. Department of Justice 2019 tells us that today, of our roughly 50 million public school children in America, about 10 million of, no, excuse me, about 5 million of them will be sexually maltreated by public school employees by the time they graduate. That is, by teachers, coaches, custodians, administrators. That's what our U.S. Department of Justice. So I'm not even going to get into all the negatives right now, but there are a lot of things that come with government-run institutional schooling. So got to keep that in mind too. Yeah, it's hard work and it's rewarding. You know, a home-based education. It's not all a bed of roses. But with that, I want to tell people, relax. Don't think you have to do institutional school at home. You got to relax, relax and enjoy your children.
Great point. You know, when we started doing this 2 years ago, I remember the first official day of school for my kids.
What was it like?
Oh, it was crazy because so my wife led the instruction and went through everything, and I came down from my office probably around noon or whatever it was, and I said, well, you know, how is it going? And she's like, we're done. I'm like, well, you've only been going at it for like 2 hours. What do you mean you're done? And she's like, we're done. Like, we went through the lessons, and I'm like, well, maybe we don't have the right curriculum, or maybe we don't have enough. Like something's off. Like, why are they at school for 6-7 hours and you're telling me in 2 hours you got all of the lessons done? I don't believe it. And I didn't believe it. And Trish and I, my wife and I, went through it together, and we decided to stick with it, even though I felt like it's not enough. It can't be enough. But like you said, we lightened up. They go on walks. They explore nature. We went down to Boston, which is about 3 hours from here, and they go to the museum, and we go to the park, and then we build a canoe together, and then we go to jujitsu. And it's like all of this stuff is included in our curriculum. It's not just, you know, the coursework that they're so used to doing.
Ryan, your story was a classic homeschool man-dad story. Like, what? What in the back of your head, you don't even know it. I can't compute. You're thinking that institutional schooling is the gold standard,
right?
And that's education. No, it's not education. That's institutional schooling. And so that's the only reason anybody would think, well, gee willikers, you can't be done with academics in 2 hours, but you can. And research actually shows that even in institutional schooling, researchers know that only 1/3 of time is what they call academic engaged time.
Right. Of course. It's
1/3.
Assemblies and recess and transferring between classes. And I get it.
Management and paperwork and trying to get the students to be quiet and stopping bullying and all of that stuff. So it's just a classic, wonderful story that you just told. It's just absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
I do like also that you're talking about the choices, because that is another one of the things I hear quite often is, you know, well, Ryan, not everybody has the luxury. That's what they say.
Yeah.
Not everybody has the luxury, or they say it must be nice that your wife gets to stay at home. And, you know, you make choices. Those are the choices. We've made choices. We've sacrificed financially in order to make this work. And I've had to bust my tail to make sure that I make more income to provide for our way of life. Those are choices that we've made, and those are choices that you can make. But I really get frustrated when I hear people who wash their hands of the choices and they say, I don't have a choice, right? I don't have a choice. We have to have 2 incomes. We have to do it this way. And I agree with you. That is incorrect, but it's going to take some sacrifice and some different ways of doing life.
Yeah. It's going to take maybe doing some self-examination. Maybe it's going to take a friend like Ryan talking with you and, okay, tell me what you mean by you don't have a choice. That is not a manly concept.
Great point.
Men are supposed to be proactive. They're supposed to make decisions. They're not supposed to be reactors. They're supposed to be actors. That's what it means. That's part of what it means to be a man. And to say that, hey, I just was born into, I was born 35 years ago and the norm is institutional public school. And the norm, which is not true, the norm is 2 parents working for money, and the norm is spending more of my money eating out and less of my money cooking forget all that. This is a season in your life for maybe only 20 years or so that you have these creations called children, and it's going to pass quickly.
Very quickly.
And how much happier are you with a car that's only 5 years old than with a car that's 10 years old? Come
It's
on.
a nominal difference, if at all.
I can give you a lot of stories, but there've been, Brian and his wife have had older vehicles all of their marriage, but the vehicle gets us there and gets us back. And we don't pay it on time. And if it breaks, we save our money till we have enough money for another vehicle. That's how we do it. And I get right in the face of friends who say, "Oh, but we can't live on that much for food." I say, how much does a 50-pound bag of beans cost? The 50-pound bag of rice and some good quality vegetables, because with rice and beans, by the way, I'm not a vegetarian, but with rice and beans, you can get pretty close to a complementary protein and all the amino acids you need. Well, I don't like that. I want more variety. I didn't ask you what you like. I said, what can you live on? You get really basic conversations, Ryan, and then people start realizing, wow, you lived on that? Yeah, we lived on that.
A choice. We made a choice to do it that way.
We made choices to have time with our children. We made choices to have Betsy have time with our children, so they were not latchkey children, and so they were not children who were raised with, bye mom and dad at 8:30 in the morning. Oh, and by the way, we'll see you at about 5:30. We'll sit down to a 20-minute meal with the TV on, and then we'll go to our gizmos and we'll all go to bed. We made choices. That's not how we lived. Our meal was every night together with our children. Remember this, minimum 45 minutes together of discussion, laughter, arguments, crying, fun, questions, academics, everything. You make choices.
I know you don't have social media. I'm really curious about that because I think it's very easy to get caught up with social media and popular culture about keeping up with the Joneses and everything else. Is that one of the reasons that you've decided not to utilize social media, or is there something else?
It's a very deliberate thing, Ryan. I have a busy life. I do research. I'm a husband still. All our children are grown. We have 16 grandchildren. I'm a part of a Christian church. I love to hunt. I like to take time on my bicycle riding to and from work and talk with people. I don't want time for television or social media. I don't need it. I have good friends. I have arguments with people and discussions, and I'm not going to condemn social media. I'm just going to say, from my experience with people and talking with many people and reading about social media and doing research on, or studying research on social media, man, oh man, I do not see the value to my life. I don't see it. At this point in history, and I hope this comes across the right way. My wife and I have made a deliberate choice at this point in our life. We still do not have cell phones. Now, people might think that's kind of odd, but you know what? In what I do, I'm on the computer and the internet all day long. I'm on email all day long. I do not need a cell phone. Now, some people might say, I need a cell phone. All right, if you need a cell phone, have a cell phone. But it's just another thing that can send me feeds that I don't want to see. News people who tell me what to believe, more distractions. I make it a point to be in touch with relationships with the phone and email and in person. In person is best. It's a choice. It is a choice, a thoughtful choice.
The one thing I'm gathering from what you're saying here too, and I've never really considered it this way until you had just said that, is you're talking about seeing things in your feed. Well, we know that technology can learn what we want to hear, is going to implant what it wants you to hear, what other people want you to hear. I don't think anyone would ever accuse you of being an uninformed individual, but it seems like you're a little bit more deliberate about how you go about getting informed versus just the default of it being planted in your pocket, in your device, in your head, and everywhere else from all these external sources.
Totally deliberate. And since, Ryan, we're talking about men, and I said earlier, men need to be proactive. Men need to stop and think about, what is my philosophy? What is my worldview? Why do I believe what I believe? What is my metaphysics, my epistemology, my axiology? How do I know what's true? How do I gain knowledge? How do I decide what's of value? You need to drive. You need to be in charge of your life and not be a passive recipient of other people who would love to control your life. There are people who want to control your thoughts. We talked about common schools and government schools. There are people who want to sell you stuff, and they want to be in charge of how you spend your money, which is how you spend your time, right? Because money comes with time, right?
Right.
And you want your time to be controlled by somebody else, or do you want to be driven what's best for your friends, your wife, your children, your church family, whatever it is? You want to be in charge of that, or do you want somebody else to be in charge of that? And it needs to be deliberate, and it is. I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but no, I'm extremely well informed. I choose my news sources. I look at a variety, and I choose. I do not let any feeds come into me. No feeds. I don't want any of that intravenous stuff, pushing me around.
It's funny you're using that figuratively, but I don't think we're too off from that being taken too literally either, with things that are implanted into us and access. I mean, we're almost, that way right now. This device is always just connected to me. It's almost a part of me at this point. So, yeah.
I mentioned how I like to do little surveys on the street, wherever I am. Grocery store, parking lot, at the beach, the gas station, on the airplane. And we won't get into my opinion on this, but I asked people over the whole last year, why do you think most people believe what they believe about a virus, about masks, about whatever? And the vast majority, Ryan, told me, they held up their hands like this and they said, social media and the feeds that we get from wherever. In other words, it was like a passive recipient letting that mold their thinking rather than being critical thinkers, deciding the values against which they want to, judge information. And most of them said that. That's what they told me.
Right. They acknowledge it.
Yeah. That they're basically like willing victims of somebody else's understanding of data and science and philosophy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If somebody's listening to this, and I know there's a lot of men who tune into what we do, they followed my journey. They know we've been educating our children at home for the past couple of years. What are some ways that somebody could get into this? There's curriculums that we use. I don't know if it's looking into a certain curriculum or if there's other advice or tips that you have for getting men and their spouses on board with this idea of educating their children.
Yeah, I think there are a few things. One, I've actually written an article on how to get going on home education, but I mean, I'm not a specialist on all the how-tos, but here's the big picture. One of the best things is if you could go to a home education conference, and before a year ago, they were in person. They're all over the place.
Right.
And they're coming back now. But go to a homeschool conference. Almost every state has a statewide homeschool organization, and you could actually go to this place, hslda.org, and look up your state, and it'll put you in contact with homeschool organizations. Okay, so you go to a conference, and it can be overwhelming. There's all these speakers and curriculum, vendor exhibits, all this stuff. But just go and listen and learn and relax. And do not think you have to go pick a curriculum or something. That's one thing. Number two, meet a few homeschool families and just talk with them. Just say, hey, how'd you get started? How did you decide your style of education? How did you choose curriculum? And try to pick a few different families with different age children. And if any one of them tells you there's only one way to homeschool, run away from them.
Right.
Because one of the beauties of home education, and this is really important, Ryan, your home-based education family needs to reflect the single parent or the mom and the dad and your children. It's a unique constellation. So Ryan and his wife might do it one way, and I might say, that's a stupid way. I don't like that way. But hey, Brian and Betsy do it a different way. And you look at that and go, it wouldn't work for my family. Like, right. I'm not your family. You're not my family. These are not your children. And so just remember that there are a lot of ways. There's a highly structured way. There's a kind of a relaxed lifestyle of learning way. There's buy a whole package of curriculum for all the subject. There's the way of saying, hey, we'll pick that curriculum for math and that one for reading, and all the rest of it we're just going to do on our own. So Go to a conference, meet 2 or 3 families, just pick their brains, and don't get overwhelmed and nervous. Okay. That's, I'll add one more thing to that. And some people might say that's irresponsible, Brian. If all you did with your children for the first couple months of your quote, now formal homeschooling was read to them, read with them, encourage them to read, and take this like 99-cent math book from Walmart and have them work through wherever they were to a little higher level, you'd be doing great.
Yeah, I could see how people would say that's irresponsible, but I can also see with the level of involvement of a parent, how actually beneficial that would really be.
You got it. That's the parents involved. You're talking, you're discussing, you're doing real life things, like you said, using a tape measure to build a boat or to build a birdhouse. You're cooking in the kitchen. You're having fun with your children. I mean, it's incredible. And we know from research, there are families who take a very relaxed lifestyle of learning approach with very little structured curriculum. And there are families who take a very structured approach and we're going to be the best in everything. And both of those groups, on average, their children are doing very well.
There's another benefit too, which is adaptability. We've used curriculums in the past, and we noticed that our 2 oldest really did well on these curriculums. And then we came to our daughter specifically with reading, and she was really struggling. We couldn't figure out why. Well, we come to find out she's dyslexic, but she's intelligent. So in the public school system, she would have been able to fake her way through. A school teacher has 30 kids. Like she can memorize a book. You'll give her a book and she'll memorize it, and you'll look at her. You'll look at her eyes and watch her read the book, and she's not reading the words. This is what struck me. She's not reading the words. She's looking at the pictures, which means that she memorized the words and the triggers of the pictures. She would have slipped right through that in public school. Yeah. But we were able to catch it because of that personalized attention. And then we realized, okay, this reading curriculum does not work for her. So what do we need to do in order to help her wrap her mind the way it works around the concept of reading? And we made some pivot, and it's been amazing.
And parents have to stay humble. Like, we don't know everything.
Of course.
I'm not saying that homeschool parents know everything. They know they don't know everything. But you figured out something, you noticed something, and you can either be cocky and arrogant and say, I can solve it all myself, or you can go online and look for some ideas and help, or you can go to a homeschool conference and, there's a workshop on helping dyslexic children. And you learn. And maybe you help her, or maybe you get a helper to help you. It's so cool. It's just great. It's just, there's so much flexibility if you're willing to be humble and learn and help your children, spend time with them. It's really a wonderful way of living. It's the way people used to live. And then we sort of like got rid of it for 120 years, and now it's making a comeback.
Yeah, maybe we're thinking a little bit, rethinking our what we did that those years ago. Yeah. There's one other objection that I often receive, and it has nothing to do with the individual. It's funny that people would even bring this up as an objection. They'll say something like, well, what about those kids, who don't have parents? And I'm curious about your answer to that.
Yeah.
But I realize that is something that is likely that could happen. It's just funny to me somebody would use that as an objection, because I'll ask, well, is that your situation? Do your kids not have involved parents? Well, no, just some don't. I'm like, well, you're responsible for yours. Why are you using this as an objection to homeschooling? I'm not saying do away with the public school system. I'm saying you should question whether or not you should be involved in that or something else.
I would say you're right. It's a red herring. It might not be meant to be a red herring, but it's a red herring, and it's moot. And you say, well, like you said, you're responsible for your children to make really good decisions and be involved in their lives. If you know of some children who don't have parents, by the way, that doesn't exist. I mean, all children, at least in the United States, either have parents or guardians, and so they live with somebody. We don't let 12-year-olds live alone. Okay, so you say, well, if you're really concerned about children who only have one parent, or they have guardians, legal guardians, and not parents, you can get involved in a nonprofit to help them or tutor them, or you can get involved while you're home educating your children. You can invite them over so that they have a role model in their lives. It's a whole thing. But what that reminds me of, Ryan, is, and I thought you were going to ask this, but you didn't, but it's related. I have some people say, well, actually, some academics have said homeschooling is selfish because it does not care about the common good. Well, again, it's a red herring. And
it's interesting.
That argues that somehow when you home educate your child and do not put them in a government or a peer dependent institution, you don't care about your neighbors, which is absolutely false. There's no empirical evidence to support that. Another thing that's really fascinating about that, for a while, many academics were saying, well, homeschooling, that's rich white people, highly educated. It was never true. It was disproportionately white for a while. But guess where homeschooling is booming now with people of darker skin color. And they're saying, hey, you critical race theory, neo-Marxist, whatever, who are saying, who, by the way, some of them said 10 years ago, homeschooling is bad for Black families. Black moms and dads are saying, you're crazy. We care about our children. We love our children. We're responsible to do what's good for our children, not try to build up something you think is a government school system that somehow makes society better for your worldview. So it's a great topic. It's so fun. Yeah. Now, but your responsibility is your children first. And then if you care about other children who have not enough of this or that, go help them.
Right.
That's the simple answer.
I agree. I mean, that's the route I usually go. It's just funny to hear people talk about that. The other one I'll hear every so often is, I put my kids there so they'll get tough and be exposed to these things and they'll learn how to be more resilient. And I'm thinking to myself, your children are incapable of resisting bad ideology. They're physically incapable of it. They cannot, by their very nature, distinguish between healthy and destructive ideology. Their brains aren't developed enough to do it. They're so impressionable. You're not hardening your kids by doing that. No. You're exposing them to something they can't defend against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an old book that says the companion of fools suffers harm. And it also says that the blind leading the blind, they'll both fall into a pit. So it's a bad argument. And, I would also say to that dad, okay, so you think you should let them be taught, trained, and indoctrinated 6 hours a day in a government institution because you think they need to be exposed to other things. Well, you know what you could do? You could be the main influence of their life, and you could invite over people with different viewpoints, people who want to beat up on your kid, and you could have them over to your house once a week after dinner. And you could watch them bully your kid, and then you could have a debate with the other guy's dad about your totally different worldviews. What a tremendous opportunity. But that's too much work. When a dad tells me that, he really doesn't want to do that work. Yeah. I think most of the time, Ryan, it's an excuse for, hey, it's just easier. It's just easier. I don't want to take responsibility. And that's an amazing thing about home education. When you take on and you actually execute the duty and the responsibility to be in charge of your child's education, you have to grow up as an adult. You can no longer blame anybody else. You cannot blame the public school system. You cannot blame the private school. You cannot blame the peers. It all falls right in your lap now. And it's rather sobering. And I think it's a good sobering of men to realize, hey, wait a minute. I am an actor. I'm not supposed to be just a reactor. And I need to take seriously what I do with my children. And I need to be in charge and not let other people be in charge and then blame them when things go poorly.
Powerful, very powerful stuff. And in line with everything we've been talking about for 6 years. Well, Brian, where do people go to learn more about what you're doing, the research that you have to back up and support the things we talked about today and everything else?
Very simple, NHERI.org. That's National Home Education Research Institute, NHERI.org. And go to Connect, and you can just sign up in 12 seconds. You can get free homeschool research news. We do not send out a bunch of junk mail. I don't have time for that. So free homeschool research news, and you can poke around our website. There's a fact sheet. There's a gob of research. Just go there. It's all over there.
Great. We'll sync it all up. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you joining us and sharing some of this stuff. It's been a tremendous part of our journey over the past couple of years. We made the decision to do this when we moved from Utah to Maine 2 years ago. And I never saw ourselves doing this, but I'm so grateful that we did. And I'm grateful for men like you and women as well who have the research, have the information, are sharing this information, trying to let people know that it doesn't need to be overwhelming, that it isn't impossible, that we can make choices. They may be difficult, but we can do it. And I appreciate you and your work.
You're welcome. And I love doing it. I enjoy doing it. Thanks for having me on, Ryan.
Thanks again.